Alright, so contrary to popular belief, I do actually enjoy fantasy. I like it quite a lot. In fact, you may not think so depending on which of my videos you've watched, but fantasy is awesome. And it's great to have something that takes you away from the mundane real life and all the boring and irritating and frustrating things and immerse yourself into a world where things are a little bit different. But I am one of those people who like just a little bit of realism in there to enhance the immersion and also for a particular aesthetic style that is not completely over the top. A lot of people feel the same way, otherwise silly fluff like this wouldn't get as many views, and mods like this wouldn't exist that refine the default shape of vanilla weapons into something more aesthetically pleasing. And so for this video, I figured rather than just talk about what is wrong in practical terms with certain fantasy designs, why not come up with my own? Redesign them, and it's only fair that if I talk crap about fantasy designs that I offer my own that somebody else can talk crap about. Makes sense, right? Okay, so let's take a look. I went with Daedric weapons because they are the most impractical looking in Skyrim. Started out with the Daedric sword, and so there's plenty of things wrong with this. I talked about that in another video, but what to do about it? Now for this one, I tried to stick as closely as I could to the original while making it more functional. And this is what I came up with. So I retained most of the shape, but I made it much less extreme and more usable. One of the major problems I saw with the blade is these massive serrations. There's nothing necessarily wrong with serrations as long as they're small enough, but these are just huge, jagged pieces of metal that would be reasonably effective against a naked enemy, but if they're even just wearing clothing, then these are very likely to get stuck on it. They draw in fabric, make it bunch up, and stop the blade and prevent it from penetrating further. Also, they could get hooked on bone and stuff like that, whereas a smooth blade will just sever everything and go right through and penetrate deeper in the cut. Could have made them even smaller than this, but I wanted to, as I said, stay as close as possible. This spike here doesn't serve any purpose, really. It's just for looks. Well, I mean, arguably you could catch an opponent's blade in there, potentially. It's not super useful, though. All that does is act as a stop, essentially. If you try to stab, the blade would run up until there's a second point to contact, and that would likely stop it and prevent the thrust from getting any further. Also, speaking of thrusts, if this ended up in an enemy's body, then the jagged corners there are very likely to get stuck. Now, the other thing is this additional layer here. This black stuff looks like an additional layer of metal that was put on top, so it adds more weight. So that's why I just skipped that. So we just have the guard going on here. The handle I made thicker because this is a very skinny handle, judging by the overall size, and this is terrible. Any kind of spike that points at your own hand and at yourself in general, this in particular is really bad. That would suck. This is not so much of a problem, although it's still way too pointy and you couldn't really use it in a fight effectively. Half swording with this kind of blade isn't exactly an option. So this is way too spiky. I, again, try to stick close to it. I could have left this knob in there, but I didn't really see the point because this is already the pommel. This already acts as a stop for the hand, and you don't really need that as well. There's nothing in particular wrong with it, but don't really need it. Of course, this isn't half as well done artistically as the original. It doesn't have the fine texture and everything. I did a pretty rough job here because I didn't want to spend too many hours on it, and also I'm not that good with art design like this. When it comes to shading and colorings, not really my strong side. So definitely simplified a lot, and I wanted to keep this red stuff here because that's kind of part of the Daedric style, and I just added kind of a gem in there just because. You could very well have some more decoration on the bare metal here, so you can make it much fancier. Also, this is the first version. I then decided to shorten the handle, because this is a one-handed sword. Why on earth do you need such a long handle? This is a two-handed handle, essentially. So it makes much more sense to make it way shorter. Next up is the Daedric Greatsword, or really long sword. It's not large enough to be an actual greatsword. Well, that just as a side note. So this one has lots of practical problems. So I had to modify the design quite a bit to make it practical, in my opinion. One issue is this right here. That's not really a good idea. I mean, to be fair, there are some historical swords that have 2 points, but generally it's not really the greatest idea, because generally what makes a thrust so effective is that it concentrates all of the force, all of your weight behind the thrust on this small little point, a tiny surface. If you have 2 surfaces that make contact with the target, then you're essentially dividing the force. So it won't penetrate as well. Even though you're stabbing the target 2 times at once, which may seem great, ultimately it's going to be a less effective thrust. The other issue here is the edge as well there is just too jagged. It's not very good at cutting. The guard isn't the worst I've seen, but it's very bulky and also really pointy here. That, again, is kind of asking for trouble. But as I said, the main issue is this is so much bulk that if you made this would be very unnecessarily heavy. The grip overall is pretty good. And then we've got the pommel here again. So, yeah, this is a bit much. Again, pointy, threatening the user. Not really ideal. So this is what I came up with, and admittedly it doesn't have a lot to do with the original. So that's a perfectly fair criticism. It doesn't really look very Daedric. On this one I deviated quite a bit from the original design to just make it as practical as I can. And part of that is just plain edge, no jagged nonsense going on. It's going to cut much better that way. A single point, not the split thing. And the guard is much, much slimmer. Now, the guard, again, doesn't really look very Daedric, so I could have definitely done this in a different way, in a more appropriate way. The pommel I changed quite a lot, and I essentially turned it into a ring pommel because it's quite large and you want to save a bit of weight on there, otherwise the balance is going to be off. If it's too heavy, then you bring the balance too close to the handle, which makes it better at thrusting but worse at cutting, and this is supposed to be pretty good at cutting. And yeah, the handle is pretty much the same as before. I didn't change that a whole lot. I went for a dark red handle to have more of the red contrast. Now, if I made the guard and pommel more black, then that would probably work better. But either way, as far as the overall shape is concerned, I'm pretty okay with that. Here's another one where I deviated a lot from the original design. The final one is going to be closer to the original. But for this, basically, I just went with single-handed axe, essentially. So I didn't stick very close to it at all. But just as kind of an idea what you could do with it, I was trying to still get this sort of Daedric style. And that's what I came up with. So again, very different from the original, and I'll explain why I did the things that I did with it. It's probably a bit too much red. You could very well make that more black and just have red accents. Accents, get it? Yeah, I'll shut up. So on this one, I essentially just said, screw it. If you want these kind of spiky protrusions, then it's way better to go with a war pick. And in fact, that's what I had originally in mind. Started out like this. I was just thinking, okay, let's just go with a war pick. There's nothing wrong with it. War picks are very, very effective. And the good thing about that is the shape doesn't matter anywhere near as much. I mean, a smooth outline is going to be more effective, no doubt. It's just going to have less resistance as it enters the target. It's just better overall. But in this case, a war pick is so brutally effective. It concentrates so much force on this small point, and it's top heavy, so you strike pretty hard with it. Doesn't really matter as much. You can get away with more artistic freedom here, and it'll still be a brutally effective weapon. So not really a problem there. And then I added that axe blade. I just kind of felt like flipping it upside down compared to the original, just arbitrarily. And I added this extra point because in this location here, it doesn't really interfere with how practical it is. It doesn't add anything of value, really, but at least it wouldn't get so much in the way. I mean, again, arguably you could say you could potentially catch an opponent's blade, so maybe it could come in handy, but either way, it's not a detriment. And it looks pretty good, like in terms of this aesthetic here. And then I just added several of those red lines to really tie in with the original design. But again, it needs more black. I do realize that. Anyway, and then we've got these langets here for reinforcement. I'll give you a closer look here. So these are just metal bars riveted. One is right in front. So if you were to parry with that part of the shaft, and incoming blade wouldn't damage the handle. And on the side as well, so you can parry with the side if you want to. Here, an extra ring for reinforcement, another bar, another ring, and yeah, they've got the handle wrap. And then I just went for a spike at the end because that's a lot more practical than this sickle-looking thing. And then finally the Daedric Battle Axe. So this is the two-handed axe, and yeah, it's got a lot of the issues going on that I already talked about. Too jagged, and particularly this is really strange. If you look at that right there, the way it kind of protrudes past the handle, I don't even know what the idea is with that. This adds really nothing at all, and it looks really weird to me, at least. Again, it's also got the problem that there's too much stuff, too many layers, apparently. Like you can see there's this red layer. On top of that is the black layer and the gray layer. So you have several different types of metal / organic material, different types of material combined together. So what I did with this one is, for one, make the handle substantially longer, because this is a two-handed weapon. The handle looks more like one-handed almost. I mean, this has to do with the way characters hold two-handed weapons in Skyrim. They all have essentially a sword grip, or baseball grip almost, on everything, the swords as well as the axes, which of course saves the developers time. They don't have to make a separate animation set for a two-handed axe. Fair enough, but doesn't look as good in my opinion, and you would definitely want a longer handle for an axe to be effective for reach and leverage, striking power, etc., etc. So here again I made the handle red to contrast with the blade. It could be black just as well, with just some red accents there. And again, I went with a spike instead of this thing because it's just more usable. The spike at the end isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like, a lot of historical axes don't have that, but it's not really a bad thing to do that. And so what I did was just cut the blade down a lot. All of this here in the center, this is too much material. You don't really need that. If it's good steel or even something better, then you don't need that much material to support the edge. It'll do just fine. And this, on the other hand, would add so much more weight that it just becomes clunky and cumbersome to use. Even if you're exceptionally strong, you're still better off with a somewhat lighter weapon. I mean, this really depends on exactly how much stronger, but either way, I mean, you're better off getting more edge rather than more core, because if you get a longer edge, then you'll still get more mass. It'll still have more heft in a strike, but this is really all you need. And on the other side, I got rid of this strongly forward curved spike, because this spike here literally cannot be employed. There's no way this would ever make contact with an enemy, really. And it would interfere if you wanted to thrust with the horn of the axe. You could do that with this design, but not with that. It would stop here. So not really very useful. So I just cut all of that away, slimmed it down a lot, but retained the basic shape here. And also I made the point, the lower horn here, stop at the handle, because I don't really see any point in making it protrude past the handle. And then we've got langets here again for mounting and reinforcement. So feel free to say what you will about these designs, if you think they are boring or just not true to the Daedric style, which is fair enough, they are not that close, then it's all fair game. But either way, I hope you found this entertaining. Thanks for watching. Check out links in the description down below, and I'll see you next time. If you liked the video, consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Or maybe you want to buy some razor blades. This also helps out the channel. Anyway, thanks for watching. Have a good one, folks.